For the Brits watching this, you know that every now and then we get a scorching summer's day. Not often. But you know the ones I mean, the ones when the ice cream just melts before it gets to your mouth and people go bright red sitting on the beach or in the pub garden. Well, on the 1st of July 1918, it was one of those sorts of days. I mean, it had been really hot all day, and even as the evening started to cast long shadows across the Trent Valley, west of Nottingham, the air remained uncomfortably warm. Walking across the meadows from the River Trent, the medieval church spire of St Mary's poked above the trees from the little village of Attenborough. And the air was filled with the music of blackbirds and robins and wrens, and the hedgerows, were a riot of colours, that the soft white petals of the daisies, the yellow buttercups, the yellow hues of the hay rattle. And if you had one of those old-fashioned fob watches and cared to look at it, the time would be just after 7 p.m. And in many ways, the war on the Western Front just seemed, so far away. And yet, on the other hand, it felt so close. Because as you look beyond the ancient spire of St Mary's Church in Attenborough, you'll see the towering chimneys of the factory of death. It hadn't always been this way. Just 4 years before, all around here had been fields and small villages. And then the Austrian Archduke had been assassinated on the streets of Sarajevo, and Europe had spiralled into the First World War. The opening months of the First World War had shown the deficiencies of Britain, who had spent the last 100 years fighting colonial wars. And the small manufacturing capacity of Britain was just totally stretched to breaking point by this new industrial scale warfare. In fact, things got so bad that by the end of 1914, the British Army was actually rationing how many shells they could be fired at the Germans every day. And finally, in early 1915, the press got hold of the story. The exposé, published in both the Times and the Daily Mail, highlighted both the shortage of shells and the fact that many failed to explode on impact. And this shell scandal forced the government to act. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, was made Minister of Munitions. The Welsh dynamo was determined to overhaul this antiquated supply system and set up a series of national factories manufacturing munitions on a scale unimaginable before. And to help him deliver this goal, he turned not to the military or to the civil service, but to the men of industry. Mavericks, go-getters, men who didn't play by the rules, who didn't respect conventional wisdoms and government red tape. And one such man was Viscount Chetwynd, an industrialist from the automobile industry. He knew nothing about munitions, but he did know about mass production. And that's what Lloyd George was after. And like Lloyd George, Chetwynd was a maverick and a self-publicist. And so it was that Chetwynd built National Shell Filling Factory number 6 at Chilwell, just to the west of Nottingham. And there, amongst the fields and rural villages, a huge 194-acre industrial complex was born, producing thousands upon thousands of high-quality shells packed with TNT for use on the Western Front. In fact, Chilwell Munitions factory would produce 19 million shells during the First World War, over half of all the shells fired by the British on the Western Front. One factory. Now, producing that many shells was a labour-demanding job, and Chetwynd faced a problem. Because, of course, many of the men, the traditional factory workers of England, were away fighting. So the only way to produce that many shells was to bring women into your workforce. Unfortunately for Chetwynd, the villages around here had an oversupply of women who had formerly been employed in Nottingham's lace industry. But of course, during the wartime, lace was not really in demand. And these skilled women were desperate for work. By the time of our story, the 1st of July 1918, 4,000 women and 6,000 men were employed at the factory. Women such as Lottie Martin, a 19-year-old from nearby Beeston. And I'll come back to Lottie in a while. These women were called the Chilwell Canaries because handling all that TNT that they were filling the shells with turned their hair green and their skin yellow. In fact, there are reports that some women even gave birth to yellow babies. During the war, over 100 women at Chilwell factory died from toxic jaundice. Chetwynd saw these problems affecting, well, not just the Canaries, but indeed all of his staff. Safer uniforms were introduced. Caps to cover their hair were issued. Masks became mandatory. Ventilation was improved in the factories and wash facilities, including baths, were made available. And he went further. Recreational clubs were set up, including sports clubs. A swimming pool was constructed on the site. And according to a local paper, the Mansfield Reporter, a band was actually hired to play in the canteen at meal times, trying to make this nasty work as safe and, dare I say, enjoyable as possible. But it was still hard work. They worked 12-hour shifts for 30 shillings pay a week. And it was still dangerous. You know, the presence of large quantities of highly combustible TNT was an ever-present danger. And, you know, poor handling or high temperatures, like today, could turn a factory into a burning hell. There'd already been explosions at similar munitions factories in Faversham in Kent, Ashton-under-Lyne and Silvertown in East London. And indeed, even here at Chilwell, there had been 17 minor explosions in the 2.5 years since the factory opened, although fortunately only 3 lives had been lost. And the fear of sabotage was also always present. You know, if the Germans, think about it, if the Germans could blow up a factory like Chilwell, producing half the shells that were fired on the Western Front, the effect on Britain's war effort would be unimaginable. And of course, if they did succeed in something like that, it wasn't just the shells and the production facilities that would be blown sky high, would it? Not surprisingly, the location of factory number 6 and the nature of its work were not mentioned outside the immediate vicinity of Nottingham. Lottie Martin looked at the clock on the mantelpiece in her parents' small house in Greyhound Yard, just off the high road in Beeston. It had just gone 7 p.m. I mentioned that she worked at the munitions factory, which was about 2 miles away to the west. But today was her day off. Well, some day off. You know, she was 19, she lived in her parents' house. She still had the washing up to do for her family. So, rolling up her sleeves on her blouse, she tied on her apron, put her hands in the sink and started to scrub the plates. At 7:10 p.m, there was the most enormous roar and the house shook violently. She looked up, and billowing into the sky was a huge yellow and black cloud. It's the factory. And she was right, because 8 tons of TNT had just exploded on the site. Back down in the village of Attenborough, Kate Abdi also ran out of her house at the sound of this massive explosion, and she later recalled the scene, and she said, yeah, debris was hanging in the golden sky, and bodies seemed to be suspended in the sky, spread eagle, before slowly coming back down to the earth. Lottie Martin ran the 2 miles from her house to the Chilwell Munitions factory gates. And as she reached the factory gates, she was met by a scene of utter devastation. And there were some of her co-workers, or what remained of them. Burnt clothes, faces black and charred, hair burnt off, limbs ripped from their bodies. Bert Smith, as an 8-year-old lad, was playing cricket with his friends when the force of the explosion knocked him off his feet. And when he stood up, all the leaves from the trees had been shredded. "That'll be Chilwell," said one of his friends. and the boys ran as fast as they could towards the factory to see what was going on. By now, the high road from Beeston towards Chilwell was filled with people, bystanders, emergency services trying to get through. In fact, the emergency services arrived within half an hour of the explosion, which is pretty impressive. Relatives running towards the factory in panic and fear. And Bert and the boys couldn't get through, it was so crowded. And at that moment, the crowds on the high road parted. And he remembers two horse-drawn carts coming along the road, past him, and he looked. And as he looked, he saw limp arms and legs hanging over the sides. The wagons, lifeless. And from the back of the wagon, blood dripped into the road, forming a trail along the high road. Bert recalls that his stomach turned as if there was, as he called it, a nest of rats in there. "Let's go home," he said, and the boys turned away. The huge explosion at the Chilwell Munitions factory shattered windows up to 3 miles away in Long Eaton, and the roar of the explosion was heard 30 miles away in the Vale of Belvoir. The huge column of smoke climbed into the evening sky, signalling the scale of the destruction beneath. By 10 p.m, Viscount Chetwynd had arrived on the site, and his very first question was about his workers and their fates. And he was told the grim news. 134 people had been killed, including 25 women, and a further 250 injured. The blast and the fire had been so intense that of the 134 workers killed, only 32 could ever be positively identified. The disaster could have been even worse if it hadn't been for the bravery of the works manager, Arthur Bristow. This 38-year-old from Lymington in Hampshire had been in the army on the Western Front. He'd been invalided out at the beginning of 1916 and had come to Chilwell to be the works manager. And now, in these critical moments, just after the explosion, he led a small team to tip burning TNT off the conveyor belts, preventing a further 15 tonnes detonating. That's twice as much as had already gone off. For his bravery, Bristow was awarded the Edward Medal, which you probably haven't heard of. But it was actually a medal that's no longer issued, but it was established just before the First World War by King Edward VII, Edward Medal. And it was awarded for acts of bravery in industrial industrial mining accidents and disasters. It was sort of like, an industry and mining version of the Victoria Cross. And until it was done away with in 1971, only 188 were ever issued, including one to Arthur Bristow that night. 12 of his fellow workers were awarded British Empire medals for their bravery that night too. Unbelievably, the clear-up effort actually enabled some work to resume the very next day. And equally unbelievable was that after this appalling tragedy, only 14 workers failed to turn up for their shift the next day. Just 2 months after the explosion, the factory actually set a record of filling 275,000 shells in a single week. For propaganda and morale purposes, the explosion was covered up, with newspapers at the time merely reporting headlines, 60 feared dead in Midlands factory explosion. Downplaying the numbers, and it was just a factory in the Midlands. It was only after the war that the full facts and the scale of the disaster were made public, and that a monument was erected on the site. A Home Office committee of inquiry was set up, but it failed to establish the cause of the explosion. Scotland Yard also made an inquiry. In the midst of war, sabotage was suspected. It could either be by German agents, the IRA, or indeed disgruntled electricians in the plant, maybe even communist Bolshevik sympathisers. Chetwynd believed it definitely was sabotage, and he actually named an individual to the police. But no one was ever charged. And Interestingly, whilst no one has ever been convicted, the police report has never been published. So, whilst sabotage in war can never be ruled out, most industry experts, most military historians actually believe that it was a combination of the high temperatures that day, lax handling, and some tired, exhausted workers just not having their eye on the ball that were far more likely to set up the conditions that caused this tragedy. After the First World War, the factory was closed down and became an ordnance depot for the army. Later still, it became the Chetwynd Army Barracks, which is still there. And the monument to the victims remains inside the military base. Part of the factory site has now been developed for housing. And in fact, I bought my very first house there in 1994. And if you wander back from the factory site, now housing development, towards the River Trent, you'll come to the church of St Mary's in Attenborough, where our story first started. And there, in the quiet tranquillity of the churchyard, with the birdsong and the hedgerow flowers, you'll find the mass grave of the 134 workers who died in the Chilwell Munitions factory explosion of the 1st of July 1918. Thanks for joining me today. And if you like this talk, give me a thumbs up down below, a like. That's always nice to get one of those, isn't it? We all need a pat on the head. And why not subscribe to my YouTube channel up there at the top of the video there. And if you want to learn more about British history, sign up for my free history talks at thehistorychap.com. I look forward to seeing you soon. In the meantime, take care.